In this part of the lesson, we're going to learn how to factor two binomials from a trinomial. This is factoring by grouping. Before we begin, let's take a look at what the answers will look like. So what we are looking for will be the factors such as x plus 4 times x plus 3. So let's see what that trinomial will look like when we distribute. We have x squared plus 3x plus 4x plus 12. So here in our first step, we have 4 terms, which is super important in factoring by grouping. We have 4 terms. Then we combine the two middle terms, which are the linear terms, and we get a quadratic trinomial, x squared plus 7x plus 12. So we will be given this quadratic trinomial and find the two factors, which are x plus 4 and x plus 3. So this is what we'll be looking for. These are the two binomials. These are the two factors of our trinomial. Let's take a look at this example where we have some negatives involved. We have x squared minus 5x minus 6x plus 30. Notice again, before we combine the middle terms, we have 4 terms, 2 linear terms. Again, this is going to be a super important step when we are factoring. So when we multiply two binomials, we have a trinomial. This is what we will be given, and we will be asked to find these two factors. X minus 6 times x minus 5 are the two factors of this quadratic trinomial. So again, notice that on each of these steps, when we multiplied these two binomials, we had 4 terms, 2 linear terms before we combined. When we are going to factor this quadratic trinomial, we will be working backward. The goal is to find these two factors, which are two binomials. Again, we will be given a quadratic trinomial, and we will be working our way up to get the two factors. So notice that when we are given this trinomial, we will break apart or split the middle term, the linear term, into 2 separate terms in order for us to create two binomials, which are the two factors of our trinomial. We will be working backward. So before we get started in practice and factoring, let's take a look at the form, the quadratic form that we will be using. Let's look at the parts. We have ax squared plus bx plus c. In all of these examples in part 2, our a value, the coefficient of our quadratic, is going to be 1. That is super important to notice. The b value is the coefficient of the linear term, and c is your constant. So let's go ahead and write our first example down. Here we have a quadratic trinomial. Our goal is to find the two binomials that were multiplied to give us this trinomial. We're going to create 4 terms, and we're going to be splitting this middle term, this linear term, into 2 different terms, but we're going to maintain the value of the expression. Let's go ahead and identify each of these parts. Our a value is 1, it's an understood 1 here. Our b value is 11, and our c value is 18. Very simple. Now, I like to use a graphic organizer to help me know what two terms I'm going to use to split the middle term. Because there's a lot of combinations. We could do 1x and 10x. We could do, 2x and 9x. There's so many combinations, but there's only one that's going to work. In the graphic organizer, I just call it a big X. The top number is going to be the product of A times C. So we have 1 times 18. The bottom number of our graphic organizer, B, you can just remember the bottom is for B. It is the B value, the B term, the coefficient of our linear is 11. So what we need to do is think of the factors of 18, what multiplies together to give you 18, but at the same time adds up to 11. So our factors of 18 are 1 and 18, we have 2 and 9, and we have 3 and 6. So here are the combinations that we have to choose from. We know that if we were to use 2 and 9, 2 times 9 gives us 18, and it also adds up to 11. So these are going to be the two factors that we will use to rewrite this 11x into two terms. And we chose, so we had 18 here. Now 18 is not just the C value. Don't get confused with that. It is A times C, because in all of these examples our A is 1. Some folks tend to think, oh, the top number is your C value. No, it's A1 times C. This will change in future examples. And then we have the 11. So the two numbers that multiply to give us 18 and add to give 11 are 2 and 9. So I'm going to rewrite this expression into 4 terms. I have not changed the value of the problem at all. 2x plus 9x is still 11x. Now, once you find your 4 terms, once you find the 2 terms to split the middle term, your linear, we're going to put grouping symbols around the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms. And if you wrote this where you had 9x first and then 2x, in the end, you still have the right answer. So don't worry about if you put 9x first and then 2x, it all comes out to be the same in the end. So now, step 1, we rewrote the middle term using 2x and 9x. Step 2, we put grouping symbols around the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms. This is where the term grouping comes from. We group these 2 terms and the 2 last terms. The third step is to factor out the GCF from each of these groupings. So x is the GCF in the first 2 terms. Then I'm left with x plus 2. This is plus. Don't forget your plus. Bring it down. The GCF in our last 2 terms is 9. So I'll factor out a 9. And then I'm left with x plus 2. So all we did is factor out the GCF in this first grouping and then the GCF in the last grouping. The last and final step is you're going to write one binomial is x plus 9, and then this common factor of x plus 2 is the second factor of our trinomial. So the two factors, if we were to multiply these together, would give us our quadratic trinomial. And you could check that out if you wanted to. So let's practice a few more. Here we have our second example. Again, our A value in these problems is always going to be 1. Our B value is 12, and our C value is 32. I'm going to use my graphic organizer to help me know how to break this linear term into 2 terms. A times C goes on top. My linear term, the coefficient of my linear term is 12. So we are looking for what multiplies to give us 32 that adds up to give us 12. We have to use 4 and 8. 4 times 8 is 32, and 4 plus 8 is 12. So 4 and 8 are the two numbers we're going to use to split the middle term. Again, we have 4 terms, which allows us to group our first 2 terms and our last 2 terms. That is step 1, we found the two numbers to split the middle. Step 2, we grouped the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms. Step 3, factor the GCF of each of our groupings. Here we can factor out an x. We're left with x plus 4. We have plus in the middle. Here we're going to factor out an 8. Notice, just like in the last example, these two factors are going to be the same. If they're not, we've made a mistake. The last step is to put the two factors. X plus 8 is one factor of our trinomial, and then we have x plus 4. These are the two factors of our trinomial. X plus 8 came from the GCFs. X plus 4 is the common factor of these two terms. X squared minus 10x plus 21. A is 1, B is negative 10, and C is 21. Our graphic organizer, 1 times 21. Our B value, negative 10. We're trying to find how can we break apart negative 10x into two terms. So we have 4 terms. 21, we have 1 and 21. We have 3 and 7. Now, we know that the two side numbers, our two factors, have to be the same sign to give us a positive product. But they must be negative to give us a negative sum. So I'm going to go with negative 3 and negative 7. So when you have negatives involved, you have a few more combinations to take a look at. So negative 3 and negative 7 are going to be the two linear terms. The next step, group the first two and the last 2 terms. Notice I still have subtraction between these two. Factor out the GCF. Seven, I'm going to divide out a 7, and it ends up being a negative 7, so be careful here. I'm going to be left with x and then minus 3. Now, when we're working with the negatives, I always like to just, in my mind, redistribute this negative 7 and see if I get back this part of the expression. So negative 7 times x is negative 7x right here. Negative 7 times negative 3 is that positive 21. So just be really careful when we have negatives involved. Now, the last step is to put your GCFs together as one binomial. And then your common binomial is your second factor. These are the two factors of our original trinomial. A is 1, B is negative 5, and C is negative 24. Our graphic organizer, A times C, our linear coefficient is negative 5. It goes on the bottom. Our B value is negative 5. So let's list the combinations. And again, we're going to have some negatives involved. So we know that one of the factors that we're going to use is going to be negative because we have a negative product and we have a negative sum. So I'll look at the combinations to see how can I get a 5. Well, I know that if I have 3 and 8 and one of them's negative, it gives me 5, and we need the 8 to be negative because our sum is negative. 3 times negative 8 is negative 24. 3 plus negative 8 is negative 5. So I'm going to split my middle term using 3x and minus 8x. 3x minus 8x is that negative 5x. Now let's group the first two and the last two. Factor out the GCF. Here we have a minus. I'm going to factor out an 8. And a negative divided by a negative is positive. The GCFs create one binomial, which is one factor. And then this common factor of x plus 3 is our second factor of our trinomial. Pause the video and you try these. Okay, our first example, I'm going to use my graphic organizer. I always like to write out what my values are. That's a good practice. So we have negative 24. Our b value is negative 2. So 24, 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, and 4 and 6. We need one of these to be negative. We have a negative product and a negative sum. And I believe 4 and 6 will do the job for us. So 4, and then let's use negative 6 because that will give us the negative 2. I'm going to rewrite our trinomial into 4 terms. I'm going to group the first two. Don't let your subtraction get lost. Factor out the GCF. When I divide negative 6 into negative 24, this should be positive here. I get x plus 4. That's what showed me that I had something wrong here because I knew these two have to be the same. So I just did not write that as a plus, and it should be positive 4x. Okay, we're gonna take our GCFs to make one binomial factor, and the other one is x plus 4. These are the two factors. Okay, here we go. Let's use our graphic organizer. A is 1, B is 8, and C is 15. On top is A times C, 1 times 15, and the bottom is 8. So we only have a couple of combinations. We can have 1 times 15 and 3 times 5. 3 and 5, everything's positive, so that's nice and neat. So 3 and 5 are the values we're going to use to split the middle. We have our 4 terms, so now we can do our grouping. This is factoring by grouping. We factor out the GCF. We put the GCF, x plus 5 times x plus 3. These are our two factors of our trinomial.